Welcome back to the Meidas Defense podcast. I'm your host, Joe Plenzler. Today on the show, we have a great conversation with Representative Eugene Vindman. From fleeing Soviet Ukraine as a 4-year-old refugee with less than $800 in his family's pockets to earning a commission in the U.S. Army, serving 25 years in uniform, and eventually being elected to the House of Representatives, Rep. Vindman's life represents the quintessence of the American dream. In this episode, we dive deep into the most pressing national security and institutional crises facing our country today. We cover his sweeping new anti-corruption legislative package, the stakes of the war in Ukraine, legal fallout from Operation Southern Spear, the conflict with Iran, and why practical bipartisan leadership is the key to bringing the country back together. Let's jump right into Rep. Vindman's story and his push to clean up Washington.
Yeah, Joe, so you and I both know that leaders in the military are held to a higher standard, not a lower standard. And what I've seen over the course of 19 months that I've been in Congress, seeing across the street in the White House, is that leaders are held to a lower standard, whether it's the president and the executive branch, his cabinet officials, or the judiciary, including the Supreme Court, or even members of Congress. For some reason, the expectation of the American people is that they're going to have fewer scruples, less integrity than the average American. And that just doesn't make sense to me. And so I think public service is a public trust. The American people deserve to know that their elected officials are making decisions based on what's best for the country and not for their own bank accounts. And, trust in government is frankly at historic lows. And we have a responsibility. I have a responsibility to tackle corruption and start to restore some public trust. No, never. And, the fish rots from the head here. Unfortunately, we're seeing a president and his family profit enormously from, this elected office. And whether it's, the gift of, a Qatari jet, which is not fit for purpose, Air Force One, or, the thousands and thousands of trades, in the stock market. I mean, there was a story, obscene, but a story that the president, and his Truth Social site will sell exclusive access to market moving information on an economy that he helps to guide. So all of this is just, it's obscene, but I see it in Congress as well, where, members of Congress are trading individual stocks, and that's just inappropriate. I believe in America. I believe in our economy and the market. And so if you want to bet on America, invest in the S&P 500, invest in index funds, but you shouldn't be investing in stocks that you either A, have insider information that is not available to the general public, or B, help regulate. And so I am all in favor of a stock ban, a complete stock ban. So when you, are sworn into office, you divest. I did that when I was sworn into office. And that's one measure. The second measure is a ban on lobbying. So former members of Congress go back to their old friends and lobby them on behalf of corporations. I want to ban that. And the last thing, and we've seen some pretty terrible examples of this. There was a U.S. Army Master Sergeant that was arrested earlier this year for betting on prediction markets about the Venezuela operation. That's a complete betrayal, right, of his brothers and sisters in uniform, and put the mission at risk. There was also the story about the teleprompter operator at the White House that was trading information. I don't think anybody listening to this right now believes that the teleprompter operator is the only one at the White House that is profiting off of insider information. And so banning members of Congress, the executive branch, the president, vice president, and judges from participating in prediction markets in the areas that they operate in.
It's hard to argue with Rep. Vindman here. Coming from military backgrounds, both he and I were raised in a leadership culture where leaders eat last. Yet looking across Washington, we see elected officials trading individual stocks with access to non-public information, former members leveraging relationships on K Street, and key figures speculating on prediction markets. Rep. Vindman's anti-corruption proposal hits three core pillars: a total ban on individual stock trading for leaders, a strict ban on lobbying for former members of Congress, and prohibiting prediction market bets by members of the military and other members of the executive branch. It's common sense policy designed to rebuild public trust when confidence in government is at historic lows. Next, we turned our attention overseas to Ukraine and the global battle between democracy and authoritarianism. Here's Rep. Vindman.
Yeah, so I'll start by saying, when my family fled the Soviet Union, we didn't even speak Ukrainian. We spoke Russian. That was the language of the regime. And so I didn't have any real family left there. What I learned about Ukraine, I learned about from like ethnic neighborhoods in the US and from studies, and then my frequent travels after I retired from the military. And so I recognize Ukraine as probably the most important geopolitical event going on today. Yes, there's a war in the Middle East, and that's actually taken up a tremendous amount of bandwidth and time, and we have competition with China. But how the Ukrainian conflict ends up is going to really have a significant impact on those other parts of the world. And so, we're in our 5th year of war. You have Russia, a larger authoritarian neighbor, attacking its smaller democratic neighbor, attempting to change the borders, the boundaries by force. Something we haven't seen in Europe since World War II. In fact, that generation, that greatest generation, fought a war to prevent that from happening. And so I think it's important to maintain the sort of rules-based order that we've had over the course of the last 80 years, because that's allowed the United States and the economy to actually develop and be the strongest economy in the world. And so the war in Ukraine has a humanitarian component. Obviously, the barbaric Russian attacks on civilian targets and infrastructure are horrendous, and the Ukrainian people are suffering enormously. But also from a selfish component for the United States, in order to maintain that environment that's allowed the United States to prosper, eliminate sort of the rules of the jungle where the larger, bigger neighbor can just attack a smaller neighbor, and threaten our friends and allies. Europe and NATO are our friends and allies. If I think the consensus is, if the Russians are successful in Ukraine, then could be Poland, it could be Romania, it could be the Baltics that are next. So this is all about our own self-interest and making sure that, you don't have a new Russian empire that, if they're able to absorb Ukraine, think about, you have battle-hardened Russian soldiers, you have battle-hardened Ukrainian soldiers. Those combine into one pretty massive, pretty aggressive, pretty dangerous force. Nobody wants to see that. And it's a lesson also for the Chinese. And, not to be long-winded on this point, but, the Chinese are paying attention to whether they can get away with what the Russians have done with Taiwan. And if they think they can, they'll suffer lots of casualties that the Russians have. They've suffered over 1 million casualties, and they'll have sanctions, but they'll achieve their objective and they can seize Taiwan. Then they'll do that. But if they think that the Western world and the United States will stand firm on its own principles and its own democratic values and defend other democracies, then they won't take that adventure.
Rep. Vindman brings a rare level of insight to this issue, not just someone who was born in Ukraine and understands the region, but as an Army veteran and a former National Security Council official who evaluated policy at the highest levels. His point is clear. Supporting Ukraine isn't charity. It's a calculated investment in American security and global stability. Allowing an aggressive power to absorb a sovereign neighbor creates a massive battle-hardened force right on NATO's doorstep and gives green lights to adversaries in Beijing. Deterrence in the Pacific begins with firmness in Eastern Europe.
Look, I'm a former Army prosecutor, Army JAG. I advise commanders in the field, including the senior-most commander in Iraq during my time there during the Iraq War. And I have significant concerns that these operations are illegal. So let's start with efficacy, right? These operations were supposed to stem the flow of fentanyl into the United States. They have done zero to stem the flow of fentanyl. They've not targeted a single fentanyl carrying vessel. They have targeted cocaine carrying vessels, but they have not stemmed the flow of cocaine. So completely ineffective in that context. But what they're doing is they've created a category of people. They've called them narco terrorists or some other form, and made them legitimate targets. Obviously, this is illegitimate. This whole process is illegitimate, but they're claiming they're legitimate military targets. That is not the case. There have been terrible stories about double tap strikes on vessels with capsized survivors. So basically, we're executing shipwrecked sailors. That is something that we prosecuted the Nazis for in World War II, and we executed U-boat commanders for that kind of conduct. And so, look, the Secretary of Defense here, Pete Hegseth, is the least competent, least capable, least experienced secretary this country has ever had. By placing our military in his hands, we have, these devastating failures like Operation Southern Watch, which is in many ways, it's a failure in the sense that it's failed to stem the flow of drugs, but it's also a moral failure. And then we have these failures in the Middle East, in Iran, in the Iran conflict, where this president, this secretary took us to war without a plan, without a exit strategy, without allies, based on hope. And we all know that hope is not a method. That a aerial bombardment campaign would be enough to bring the Iranians to their knees. That the Iranian people would rise up, and that's not happened. And here we are, and we're in a pickle.
As a former JAG officer, Rep. Vindman points out a critical operational failure. Blowing up target vessels without positive identification destroys vital human intelligence and evidence that would otherwise dismantle whole cartels. Worse yet, targeting capsized survivors creates severe moral injury for our service members, the very men and women tasked with executing these orders. This led us directly into our discussion on the widening regional conflict with Iran and the urgent need for congressional oversight of that misguided war.
Look, in the opening days of the war, there was a strike on a logistics site, Al Shuaiba, and one of the casualties was a constituent from Spotsylvania County. And so when they brought him back as part of the dignified return ceremony at Dover, I was there, and I met his family, his widow, his two kids, and I met all of the families of the fallen. And I was literally 5 steps behind the president when the coffins were rolling by, and thinking to myself, how many more there will be? And we know up to this point, 18. And the question is, are we better off now than we were before this conflict started? And the short answer is, no, we're not. The American people are paying for it in blood and treasure. We have had 18 killed, hundreds and hundreds wounded, and we still don't have accurate figures because this department, led by the incompetent Pete Hegseth, will not accurately reflect numbers of those casualties. And in treasure, the claim is that there were, somewhere around 30 billion. I think that is a vastly underselling the cost of this war. I think we're probably more like 3 times that. Gas prices are up, fertilizer, we have tons of farmers in the 7th Congressional District, and they're having a hard time paying for fertilizer. And so that's going to translate into higher grocery costs. And there's no end in sight, because we went into this war without allies, without building the case to the American people, without a plan on how we're going to achieve our objectives, without a exit strategy. And this president, with his cabinet, including Pete Hegseth, they have no concept on how to get us out of it. And I think, granted, the president will never heed my advice, but if there was one step to take today in order to start to turn things around, that step is to fire Pete Hegseth. There is no concept. There's no realistic way that we get out of this with the incompetent leadership we have at the top of the Department of Defense.
What stands out about Rep. Vindman's approach is that he couples rigorous executive oversight with genuine bipartisan productivity. In a district as politically diverse as Virginia's 7th, voters aren't looking for hyper-partisan soundbites. They want effective leaders who focus on common ground, economic relief, and governing responsibly.
Look, I'm tremendously proud of the work that we've done in Congress in the last 19 or so months. I'm the most bipartisan member of the Virginia delegation. We've introduced north of 60 bills, 62, I believe, 50 of which are bipartisan. I've co-sponsored 900 pieces of legislation. The vast majority of it is bipartisan. So I look for opportunities to make progress and common sense solutions. But where we have to hold the line when it comes to this war, this terrible war in Iran and Ukraine, against boat strikes, against corruption, I will hold that line. And that's why the next 97 days are absolutely so critical. Like, this is our opportunity to start turning the ship around, to win back the House, win back the Senate potentially, and then have accountability and a positive agenda. And so we're going to continue to work our tails off. And I encourage everybody to go to VindmanForCongress.com to support my campaign in a very purple district and help us win back the House.
That wraps up today's conversation with Rep. Eugene Vindman. Whether discussing anti-corruption legislation, national defense, foreign policy, or local community leadership, one constant remains clear. Our republic functions best when people of good faith step into the center to resolve issues for the common good. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit subscribe, leave us a review, share this episode with friends, drop a comment in below, and you can follow Rep. Vindman's work at VindmanForCongress.gov. Until next time, keep engaging, stay informed, stay engaged in your community, and defend the Constitution. I'm Joe Plenzler. Thanks for listening to Meidas Defense Podcast.
Want to stay plugged in? Become a subscriber to our Substack at MeidasPlus.com. You'll get daily recaps from Ron Filipkowski, ad-free episodes of our podcast, and more exclusive content only available at MeidasPlus.com.